The 4:15 from London Victoria was running 3 minutes late, which suited Hercule Poirot perfectly well. He had always believed that a train arriving precisely on time was a minor miracle, and miracles, in his experience, were best left to those who had not spent 40 years studying the darker corridors of human nature. He sat in his first-class compartment with his small patent leather shoes placed together at exactly the same angle, his moustaches freshly waxed despite the hour, and a cup of railway tea cooling beside him, untouched, as railway tea always was. He had ordered it out of habit. He drank it out of politeness to no one in particular. It was the man across from him who first broke the silence. "You are Poirot," the man said. Not a question, and the statement delivered with the blunt confidence of someone who had spent decades making declarations and having them obeyed. "I recognized you at Waterloo. Didn't say anything. Wanted to observe you first." Hercule Poirot looked up from his window. The man was perhaps 70, perhaps older. Age had compressed him rather than diminished him, the way old oak becomes denser with time. He had heavy white brows, a jaw that had once been formidable and still carried traces of that old authority, and eyes the color of dirty river water. He wore an excellent suit, but wore it carelessly, the way men do who have had money long enough to stop performing it. "And what did your observation yield, monsieur?" "Harcastle, Sir Edmund Harcastle." He did not offer his hand. "My observation yielded this. You are a man who notices things other people miss, and you are bored." Poirot inclined his head. "You are perhaps half correct." "Which half?" "I will leave that for you to determine." Poirot folded his hands in his lap. "And you, Sir Edmund? What does your observation yield about yourself? Because unless I am very much mistaken, you are a man who is frightened." The silence that followed was of a particular quality. Not the silence of denial, and not the silence of offense. It was the silence of a man who has been told something true, and does not yet know whether to be grateful for it. Sir Edmund looked out the window. The countryside was sliding past in the grey November light. Bare hedgerows, sodden fields, the occasional farmhouse sitting sullen in the mist. "I'm having a gathering," he said finally. "This weekend, Ashford Manor. You may have heard of it. Some family, some associates. My solicitor." He paused. "I intend to revise my will on Sunday morning." "A significant occasion," Poirot said pleasantly. "A necessary one?" Sir Edmund's jaw tightened. "I have been careless. With people. With trust. I'm an old man, Poirot, and I've made enemies the way other men make friends, naturally and without thinking. Now I wish to see clearly before I die. I wish to know who is who. And you have invited them all to Ashford for this purpose." I sent them each a letter. Something shifted in the old man's face. Something that might, in another man, have been called shame. An unusual letter. Poirot waited. It said, "Come to Ashford, tell the truth, or die." The train jolted slightly over a junction. Poirot's cold tea rippled in its cup. "Mon Dieu," he said softly. Not with alarm, with the quiet attention of a man who has just heard the opening chord of a symphony he recognizes. "I wanted to shake them," Sir Edmund said. "I wanted to see their faces when they arrived, whether they came at all, what excuses they made." He looked back at Poirot. "I did not expect them all to come, but they are all coming." "And now you are frightened," Poirot said. "Now I'm frightened," Sir Edmund agreed. He extended an invitation, formal, almost stiff, the way proud men ask for help. And Poirot accepted it with the graciousness of a man who had been handed something interesting and knew it. Ashford Manor announced itself before it was visible, the way large old houses do, through the gatekeeper's lodge at the end of a long gravel drive, through the smell of wood smoke and wet stone, through the particular hush that settles around places where much has happened and little has been forgotten. The house itself was Victorian Gothic at its most unrepentant, towers at each corner, mullioned windows that stared out at the grounds like suspicious eyes, ivy so old it had practically become structural. Poirot stepped from the motor car Sir Edmund had arranged and stood for a moment in the fading afternoon light, looking up at the house. There was something about it that reminded him, unpleasantly, of a mouth about to close. He was shown to his room by a young housemaid who bobbed her head and said nothing, and it was only when he was unpacking his things, arranging his pomade, his brushes, and his small travel clock with the care of a man who finds order comforting in disordered times, that he heard, from somewhere below, the sound of voices. Not happy voices. The voices of people who have all arrived at the same destination and are already, quietly, assessing one another. He went down to meet them before dinner. The drawing-room had been arranged with a fire burning at one end and drinks at the other, and the people distributed between these two poles, according to temperament. Near the fire stood a young woman, dark-haired, tense, with the particular stillness of someone who is being very careful about what their face is doing. This, Poirot would later learn, was Nora Ashby, Sir Edmund's daughter by his first marriage. She held her sherry glass with both hands. Near the drinks stood a man of about 50, a broad-shouldered and pink-faced, with the forced ease of someone accustomed to social situations and not presently comfortable in this one. Thomas Harcastle, the nephew. He laughed at something no one had said and poured himself what was clearly not his first whisky. On the settee sat Lady Vivian Harcastle. And here Poirot paused, because she was the kind of woman who demanded a pause. She was perhaps 35, with the composed, expensive beauty of a painting that has been very carefully preserved. She wore dark green and her hands were still in her lap, and she was looking at nothing with an expression of such perfect serenity that Poirot immediately distrusted her entirely. In the corner by the window, talking quietly to himself, or perhaps to his own reflection, stood Mr. Julian Voss, the solicitor. He was a slight and precise man with gold-rimmed spectacles and the careful posture of someone carrying documents he does not wish to crease, which, as it happened, he was. And near the door, almost invisible in the way that servants learn to be invisible, stood Mrs. Clara Pont. She was 60, perhaps, with iron-grey hair and a face that had once been soft and had long since decided against it. She had been housekeeper at Ashford for 30 years. She knew every room, every door, every creak of every floorboard. She was watching Sir Edmund with an expression Poirot could not immediately classify. It was not hatred. It was not love. It was something older and more patient than either. Dinner was served at 8. Sir Edmund presided at the head of the table with the manner of a man who has always presided and expects no interruption to this. And the food was excellent. The conversation was not. It moved in careful circles around the things no one was saying, which is to say, it moved around the letter. The strange, threatening letter each of them had received, and none of them had yet mentioned. It was Sir Edmund himself who broke the circling. He set down his wine-glass with a small, deliberate click. "I shall sign the revised will on Sunday morning," he said, into a sudden silence. "Mr. Voss has the document. The terms are substantially changed from the previous version." He looked around the table slowly, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. "I will say only this. One of you will be very pleased. The rest of you will not." He picked up his glass again and drank. No one spoke. And in that silence, Poirot heard something. Not a sound, but a shift, a collective tightening, and 7 people at a table, each calculating, each rearranging something behind their eyes. He looked at Mrs. Clara Pont last. She was not calculating, she was not rearranging, she was simply waiting. The house settled into itself after midnight. That was the only way to describe it, the way old houses do when the fires have burned low and the last footstep on the stair has faded and the building itself seems to exhale. The pipes ticked, The wind moved across the roof in long, quiet sweeps. Somewhere in the east wing, a shutter that had not been properly latched swung open and closed in a rhythm that was almost peaceful. Hercule Poirot did not sleep. This was not unusual. He was not a good sleeper in unfamiliar houses, and this house felt particularly unfamiliar. Not in the way of strangeness, but in the way of concealment, as if it knew things and had decided, long ago, not to share them. He had been lying in the dark for perhaps 2 hours, listening to the house, when he heard it. Not a scream, exactly. Something shorter than a scream. A sound with all the breath taken out of it. The sound a person makes when they open a door and find something behind it that the mind refuses, for just a moment, to accept. Then silence. Then footsteps, rapid, uneven, and a woman's voice, high and strange. "Someone, please. The study." Poirot was already sitting up. He was out of bed and into his dressing gown before the voice had finished traveling down the corridor, and he had the particular quality of a man who moves quickly without appearing to hurry. Neat, deliberate, his small feet finding the floorboards that did not creak. The study was on the ground floor at the far end of the west corridor. By the time Poirot arrived, 3 others were already there. Lady Vivian stood in the doorway in a silk dressing gown the color of smoke, one hand pressed flat against the doorframe. She was not trembling. She was breathing very carefully, as if each breath were a decision. Beside her, Thomas Harcastle stood in his shirt sleeves, still holding the glass of whiskey he had apparently carried down from his room. A detail Poirot filed away with the quiet efficiency of a man sorting correspondence. Dr. Felix Crane had arrived from the opposite direction and was already moving into the room past the 2 of them with the practiced speed of a medical man. Sir Edmund Harcastle was in his chair behind the great mahogany desk. He was quite dead. Poirot looked at him for a long moment before looking at anything else. This was his habit and his discipline. To see the person first, before the scene, because the scene could be arranged, but the body told its own truth. Sir Edmund sat as a man sits who has not had time to fall, upright, almost composed, his hands resting on the arms of the chair. His face was turned slightly toward the window, as if, at the last, he had wanted to look at something other than the room he was dying in. His color was wrong in a particular way Poirot had seen before. "Poison," Dr. Crane said from across the desk. He straightened up. "I cannot say which kind. Not yet. But the presentation is consistent." He removed his spectacles and polished them with a corner of his pajama top, which was, Poirot noted, something people did when they needed a moment to arrange their expression. "He has been dead, I should think, between 1 and 2 hours." Poirot moved into the room. The desk was a large one, leather-topped, darkly polished, the kind of desk bought to last generations. On it, a reading lamp that had been left burning, its light now pressing orange and futile against the gray beginning of dawn at the window. A pen, an inkwell, a small empty glass. No, not a glass. A crystal tumbler, and within it the faint residue of something that had been drunk, but nothing else. No bottle, no box, no second vessel of any kind. And then, in the center of the desk, weighted beneath the pen, a single sheet of white paper. The handwriting was Sir Edmund's. Poirot had seen it on the travel documents in the train and recognized the forward-leaning, slightly impatient hand. The words were few. "I've confessed my sin. Now it is the other's turn." Poirot read it twice. Then he stepped back, clasped his hands behind him, and looked around the room. The window was latched from the inside. The door had been locked. Lady Vivian had said so, which was presumably why her voice had carried. She had needed someone with her to push it open, and Thomas had been the nearest. The key was in the lock on the inside. The fireplace held only cold ash. The single bookcase along the far wall was undisturbed. The books stood in their orderly rows with the patience of books that are owned rather than read. Nothing had been taken. Nothing had been overturned. The room had the horrible tidiness of a planned thing. By 7 in the morning, the local police constable had arrived. A solid, well-meaning man named Hedges, who knew the house and held his helmet in both hands and was very clearly out of his depth. He deferred to Poirot with a relief so transparent it was almost touching. The household assembled by degrees in the drawing-room. No one had slept again. Mrs. Clara Pont had made tea, a great deal of tea in the automatic way of someone who, in a crisis, defaults to function. Nora Ashby sat with her cup untouched, looking at nothing. Mr. Julian Voss had, Poirot noticed, brought his leather document case downstairs with him and held it on his lap, and had not let it go. Poirot stood near the window and watched them. He was thinking about the note. "I have confessed my sin." In whose handwriting it was not in question. That was Sir Edmund's hand, unmistakably. But the question was not who had written it. The question was when and why, and whether the man who wrote it had any idea what was coming next. He was also thinking about Mrs. Clara Pont, who was moving through the room offering tea to people who did not want it, and whose face was composed in a way that was not grief and not guilt, but something in between, something older and more complicated. "Dr. Crane," Poirot said quietly, drawing the man aside from the others. "You have known this household long." Crane looked at him. He was a thin man, academic in bearing, with a quality about him of someone who has lived too long with something uncomfortable and has made a kind of peace with the discomfort. 22 years, he said. "And Sir Edmund's health, in recent weeks?" He was not a well man. His heart. I had told him. He stopped. "You had told him what? Mon ami?" Crane looked at his hands. That he had perhaps 6 months, perhaps less. He said it flatly, the way doctors learn to say difficult things. He knew. He had known since September. Poirot nodded slowly. This was, he reflected, not a surprise. It explained several things. The urgency of the will, the gathering, the strange letter. A man who knows he's dying tends to want his accounts settled before the end. The question was, what kind of settling Sir Edmund had intended, and whether someone had decided to do it for him. The note troubled Poirot most, not its content, but its tone. He had read many last words in his career, genuine and manufactured, and they had a particular grammar. Last words. They were either final in the way of resignation, or final in the way of performance. Sir Edmund's note read, to Poirot's ear, none like neither. It read like the beginning of something. "I have confessed my sin. Now it is the other's turn. Not forgive me, not I am sorry. But now it is the other's turn, the turn of the others, as if the writer expected there to be a continuation, as if he expected to be there for it." Poirot stood at the window and looked out at the grounds of Ashford Manor. The lawns were grey and wet, the old oaks at the perimeter barely visible in the November mist. A gardener moved slowly across the far edge of the drive, unknowing, tending to something. Behind him in the room, the living waited, and Poirot's little grey cells, which had been still and attentive all morning, quietly began to move. Poirot began, as he always began, not with the evidence, but with the people. Evidence could be arranged. People, under sufficient pressure, he always revealed something true. Not necessarily about the crime, but about themselves, which in Poirot's experience amounted to the same thing. Every crime was a human act. Every human act had a human logic. The difficulty was in finding the particular logic that belonged to the particular human, which required, above all else, careful listening. He began with Nora Ashby. She received him in the morning room, which she had apparently claimed as a private space by the simple act of sitting in it and looking as though she had every right to. She was younger than she had seemed at dinner, perhaps 28, perhaps 30, with a directness in her face that Poirot found immediately honest and therefore worth examining carefully. Honest people could lie too. Sometimes they were the most accomplished liars, because they so rarely needed to. "You will ask me if I killed him," she said, before Poirot had settled himself. Eventually, Poirot agreed pleasantly. "But first, you arrived yesterday at what hour?" "4. I drove myself." She folded her hands in her lap. "I don't have a great deal of money, Monsieur Poirot. I work as a secretary in Guildford. I took 2 days from my employer and drove here in a motor car that cost me £45 and requires considerable goodwill to start." "And the letter you received? Sir Edmund's letter. What did you make of it?" Something moved across her face. "I thought he was being theatrical. He was always theatrical." She paused. "And then I thought, what if he isn't? What if this is real? So I came." "You said he was always theatrical," Poirot noted. "You knew him well?" "He was my father." She said it simply, but simply in the way that simple things are when they have been considered many times and worn smooth by consideration. Or, "He was the man I was told was my father," which is not quite the same thing. Poirot was still. "And this distinction, when did you learn of it?" Nora looked at him with something that was almost admiration. "You go directly to things, don't you? My mother told me 3 years ago, before she died. She said that Edmund Harcastle was not my biological father. She wouldn't tell me who was. Only that Edmund knew, had always known, and had chosen to raise me regardless." She paused again. "Or had been paid to. I was never sure which." "And did you confront Sir Edmund with this?" "I wrote to him. He sent back 3 lines, and he said, 'Come to Ashford this weekend. All questions will be answered.'" She looked down at her folded hands. "So here I am. And now there are no answers, are there? There's just a dead man and a house full of people who are all very busy not looking at each other." Poirot thanked her and rose. He had what he needed from her. Not guilt, not innocence, but something that might become relevant. A woman who had come expecting an answer and found instead a corpse, and who was consequently less frightened than she was furious. Fury, in Poirot's observation, was rarely about murder. It was almost always about something older. Thomas Harcastle was in the library, which surprised Poirot until he saw that Thomas was not reading. He was standing at the window with his hands in his pockets. She staring out with the glassy distraction of a man reviewing catastrophic financial calculations. "Sit down," Thomas said, without turning around, as if he had rehearsed this and had decided on authority as his chosen posture. "I suppose you want to interview me?" "I would prefer to have a conversation," Poirot said. He sat without being invited. "You were close to your uncle?" Thomas turned from the window. He was a big man physically, but was doing something smaller with himself today. Shoulders pulled in, color higher than it should be, the slightly glassy look of a man who had been drinking steadily since before breakfast and was managing it with the expertise of long practice. "Depends what you mean by close. He was the only rich relation I had. I was the only nephew he had. Now we were useful to each other in the way that's easy to mistake for affection. And recently, was this usefulness still in operation?" Thomas sat down heavily in the armchair across from Poirot. He'd heard about the gambling. Of course he had. He heard about everything, God knows how. 6 months ago he called me to London, sat me down, and told me that he was aware I had borrowed against my inheritance, that he had documents. He rubbed the back of his neck. He wasn't angry. That was the strange thing. He was almost curious, as if I were an experiment that had yielded an interesting result. What did he say he intended to do? He said the will would reflect my choices. Thomas smiled without warmth. That was how he put it. "The will shall reflect your choices, Thomas. I spent 4 months not sleeping properly." He looked at Poirot. Now the will is... Well, we'll see, won't we?" "We shall," Poirot agreed. "Tell me, last night, where were you between midnight and 3? "In my room," Drinking. Alone. He said it without embarrassment because it was simply true. No alibi worth having. I know how that looks. It looks, Poirot said gently, like a man who did not go to much trouble to construct a story. This, in my experience, is either a sign of innocence or of a very sophisticated intelligence. Thomas looked at him. Which do you think? I think, Poirot said, rising, that I have not yet asked you what I most wanted to ask you. Thomas blinked. What's that? Did Sir Edmund ever speak to you of Mrs. Pont? Of her history? Of where she came from before Ashford? A pause. Brief, but present. No, Thomas said. But his hands, resting on the arms of the chair, one had tightened almost imperceptibly. Poirot noted this and left him to his window. Dr. Felix Crane was the most difficult. This was not because he was evasive. He was, in fact, almost compulsively forthcoming, which Poirot recognized as its own kind of evasion. He talked readily about Sir Edmund's health, about the household's history, about his own 22 years as family physician. He offered opinions, anecdotes, medical detail. He was, in short, a man who talked to avoid saying anything. The death certificate, Poirot said, cutting through a particularly thorough account of Sir Edmund's dietary habits. Crane stopped. The death certificate, Poirot said again, pleasantly. Not Sir Edmund's. I refer to a previous one. You have, I believe, unsigned a death certificate in this household before. Crane's face went through several things very quickly. Shock, calculation, the brief, bright flare of an impulse to deny, and then, because he was not ultimately a stupid man, resignation. 1914, he said quietly. Lady Eleanor Harcastle, Sir Edmund's first wife. He looked at the floor. She did not die of the cause I listed. And the true cause? Crane was a long time answering. She was not ill, he said at last. She was frightened. She had told me things in confidence about the state of her marriage, about things Edmund had done. He looked up and his eyes were very tired. She disappeared one morning in March. Edmund told me she had died, had a body cremated before any proper examination could be conducted. Asked me to sign the certificate. I was young. I was compromised. He stopped. I have not had a peaceful night since. Poirot looked at him for a long moment. Was she dead? He asked quietly. Crane said nothing, and in his silence the shape of something very large began to form at the edge of Poirot's thoughts. Julian Voss had not put down his document case. Poirot had noticed this from the moment the household had assembled after the discovery of the body, and he had continued to notice it through breakfast, which no one had eaten, and through the mid-morning when Constable Hedges had taken statements in the dining room with the painstaking slowness of a man writing in the dark. Voss had sat through all of it with the leather case across his knees, one hand resting on its clasp, like a soldier who has been told never to surrender his weapon. Poirot arrived at the solicitor's door at 11 and knocked precisely once. "Come in," Voss said from somewhere behind it. His voice had the quality of a man who has been expecting this and has decided to be ready for it. The room allocated to Voss was the smallest of the guest bedrooms, which was either an oversight or a statement. In old houses with long memories, the allocation of rooms was rarely accidental. It was tidy to a degree that suggested deliberate management. Voss was a man who imposed order on unfamiliar spaces as a matter of professional habit. His suits hung with mathematical precision. His shaving kit was arranged along the window-sill. The document case sat on the bed beside him. "Monsieur Voss," Poirot said, taking the single chair, "let us not dance around the furniture. I'm interested in the will." "The will," Voss said carefully, "is a legal document in my—" "There are two wills," Poirot said. Voss went very still. "I do not say this to alarm you," Poirot continued in his most amiable manner. "I say it because I am a man who pays attention to small things, and you, Monsieur Voss, have been carrying that case as though it contains something heavier than its size suggests. A single document does not make a man nervous. But a contradiction. Now that is a different matter. Voss looked at him for a long moment. Then he placed the case on the bed beside him, and opened it and removed 2 documents. He set them side by side on the bedspread with a care that was almost ceremonial. "He asked me to bring both," Voss said at last. "Sir Edmund. He telephoned me 3 weeks ago and said he needed 2 documents prepared. The first," he touched the left-hand document, "was the legitimate revised will. Drawn up properly, witnessed, legal in every respect. It supersedes the previous version and leaves the bulk of the estate to—" He paused. "Continue," Poirot said. "To Mrs. Clara Pont." Voss said the name with the flatness of a man who has been surprised by something and has had 3 weeks to absorb the surprise, but has not quite succeeded. "The housekeeper, the entire estate, Ashford Manor, the investments, the bank accounts, everything." The room was very quiet. "And the second document?" Poirot asked. "A forgery," Voss said. The word clearly cost him something. Sir, he asked me to prepare a version, superficially identical in format but with different beneficiaries. That could be shown to the other guests, as a test." He looked deeply unhappy. He wanted to present the false version at dinner Sunday morning and observe the reactions, to see who was relieved and who was not, and then, I presume, to produce the genuine article and sign it in front of witnesses. "A dangerous game," Poirot observed. "A profoundly dangerous game," Voss agreed. "I told him so. He was entirely uninterested in my opinion." He looked at the 2 documents with the expression of a man regarding evidence of his own poor judgment. "I should not have agreed, I know that, but Sir Edmund was a man who—" He stopped himself. He had a way of making the unreasonable seem inevitable. Poirot nodded slowly. He understood this, that he had met perhaps 4 or 5 people in his life who possessed this quality, the ability to make the world conform to their expectations, not through force, but through a kind of gravitational certainty. Such people generally came to one of 2 ends. They died quietly in their beds at an advanced age, universally feared, or they were killed by someone who had finally, after much suffering, decided to push back. "Tell me," Poirot said. "The genuine will. Mrs. Pont as sole beneficiary. Did Sir Edmund give any reason?" "None that he shared with me." Voss hesitated. He said only, and I am quoting him precisely, he said, "It is a debt, long overdue." A debt. Poirot filed this away alongside the other things. Crane's silence about Lady Eleanor, Nora's uncertainty about her parentage, the expression on Mrs. Pont's face when she looked at Sir Edmund at dinner, that patience, that waiting, a debt 30 years old. He thanked Voss, who looked as though he very much wished he were in his Chancery Lane offices dealing with something uncomplicated, like contested boundary fences, and went to find Lady Vivian. She was in the garden. This struck Poirot as either brave or careless, given the temperature. November had settled into its most persuasive misery, with a fine, penetrating rain that wasn't quite fine enough to be dismissed. But Lady Vivian stood on the terrace outside the drawing-room, with her coat pulled around her and a cigarette burning in her fingers, and she looked more comfortable out here than she had looked anywhere inside. "Shh! I suspected you'd come eventually," she said without turning. She had heard his step on the stone, hard presumably, or perhaps she simply expected to be sought. "Come outside. I find I can't breathe properly in that house at the moment." Poirot stood beside her at the balustrade, looking out over the wet lawn with an expression of controlled suffering that was entirely genuine. "Lady Vivian," he began, "don't be formal. Everyone else is being unbearably formal, and it's making things worse." She drew on her cigarette. She was even more beautiful at close quarters, in the thin, cold light, without the softening effect of candlelit dining rooms. But there was something around her eyes, a tension, a watchfulness, that told Poirot the beauty was not the most interesting thing about her. You want to know about Robert? Poirot blinked. I beg your pardon? Robert Ainsley. I'm the man I've been seeing. She said the last word with a slight emphasis that conveyed the insufficiency of the word for whatever the reality was. Edmund knew. He made it his business to know everything. He told me 3 weeks ago that he knew, and that the new will would reflect my infidelity, unless I came this weekend and made certain decisions. What decisions? She turned to look at him. Her eyes were a very clear grey, and they were not frightened. He wanted me to leave. Walk away from the marriage, Robert. Everything. Come back to Ashford and be the dutiful wife for whatever time he had left. She drew again on her cigarette. He said he needed a witness. Someone loyal. Someone who would sit with him at the end and not want anything from him. She exhaled. I think, in his way, he was asking for forgiveness. If only he couldn't say the word. And Robert Ainsley? Poirot asked. Where is he? In London, not knowing any of this is happening. She looked back out over the lawn. I haven't decided yet, about any of it. She paused. I suppose it's decided for me now. Do you grieve? Poirot asked, very gently. She considered this honestly, which he appreciated. I grieve for what he might have been, she said at last, not what he was. She stubbed out her cigarette on the stone balustrade. Is that an answer? It is a very complete one, Poirot said. One more thing. Last night, you were the one who found him. I couldn't sleep. I came downstairs for a book. The study light was still on under the door. She paused. I knocked. No answer. I felt something was wrong. I don't know how. I just felt it. She looked at him. I tried the handle. Unlocked. I went for Thomas because his room was nearest. He had the weight to push the door. The key, Poirot said, was in the lock on the inside. Yes. She frowned slightly. I remember thinking, how strange. Why lock a door from the inside and keep the key in the lock? Quite so, Poirot said. He left her on the terrace and walked back through the drawing room and through the hall and stood for a moment at the foot of the staircase in the cold quiet of the house. He was thinking about locked doors, because in his experience the question was never why someone locked a door, the question was always, who else had a key? There was a moment, quite ordinary in itself, that Poirot returned to again and again throughout that long grey afternoon. And it was the moment at dinner when Sir Edmund had made his announcement about the will. The small, deliberate click of his wine-glass on the table, the slow survey of faces, the words delivered with such controlled precision. Poirot had watched all of them. Thomas's grip on his knife, Julian Voss adjusting his spectacles, Nora's stillness, Lady Vivian's perfect composure, Dr. Crane's hands very flat on the tablecloth, and Mrs. Clara Pont standing near the sideboard, a serving dish in both hands. She had not been startled. She had not reacted in the way of someone hearing something unexpected. She had, if anything, looked satisfied. The way a person looks when a thing they have waited a long time for has finally, after considerable patience, begun to arrive. He had been wrong to leave her until last. Or perhaps, he reflected, so he had been right in the way that a dessert is right at the end. Not because it is less important, but because it is the thing the meal has been moving toward all along. He found her in the kitchen. The kitchen at Ashford was the kind that had been built for a larger household. A room of considerable size, with a high ceiling and a range along one wall and a long central table scarred by decades of use. Mrs. Pont was not cooking. She was sitting at the table with a cup of tea and her hands folded around it, and she looked at Poirot when he came through the door with an expression that was simply and entirely unsurprised. I wondered when you'd come, she said. No, please sit, or can I offer you something? Just the statement, direct and unadorned. You are not like the others, Poirot said, sitting across from her without ceremony. Oh, no. She drank from her tea. I am not. They are all frightened, Poirot observed, or performing frightened, which sometimes amounts to the same thing. You are neither. I have been frightened for 30 years, Mrs. Pont said. A person runs out eventually. Poirot placed his hands on the table. Tell me about Eleanor. She looked at him for a long time. The kitchen clock ticked. Outside the window the rain had intensified. It ran in grey sheets across the yard, turning the flagstones dark. Eleanor Harcastle was my sister, Mrs. Pont said at last. The words were very simple. They had the simplicity of things kept a very long time and finally released. Your older sister, Poirot said, not as a question. By 3 years, she was the beautiful one. Everyone said so. It was always the first thing anyone said about Eleanor, as if beauty were her primary characteristic and everything else about her arranged itself around it. She looked at her tea. She met Edmund in 1901. He was charming then. Charming in the way that very certain men can be charming. He made you feel that his attention was a gift, that being noticed by him was something you'd earned. A brief, complicated pause. He was not kind, not after the first year. He was, I do not like to use the word cruel because it implies he took pleasure in it. He was simply completely indifferent to suffering that was not his own. And Eleanor, she stopped. Eleanor loved him, Poirot said gently. Eleanor was loyal, which is not the same thing but looks very similar from the outside. She set down her cup. In 1912, she wrote to me. She said she had found something. Documents, she said, financial documents. That indicated Edmund had done something. She was not specific. She said she was frightened of what he would do if he found out she knew. Mrs. Pont's hands had tightened around the cup. I came to Ashford. She met me in the garden. She looked hollowed out, as if something inside her had been removed. She was quiet for a moment. She disappeared in March 1914, she said. I was told she had taken ill suddenly and died. Dr. Crane signed the certificate. There was a cremation. I was not invited. Her voice did not waver, but her knuckles were white against the ceramic. Edmund sent me £20 and a letter that said, These have been difficult times for us all. £20, my sister's life at £20. And you came to Ashford, Poirot said, 6 months later, as housekeeper. She looked at him steadily. He didn't recognize me. Eleanor and I were not alike in our faces. I had a different surname. I married briefly, a mistake, but a useful one. I came here to find out what happened to my sister, and to be here, to make sure that he paid. You have been here 30 years, Poirot said. 30 years, she agreed. Learning everything, every room, every drawer, every conversation he thought no one was listening to. She paused. 4 months ago I found the letters in a locked box in the cellar. Eleanor's letters to Edmund from the year before she disappeared, and his replies. She looked directly at Poirot. She was not dead, Monsieur Poirot. He had her committed, a private asylum in Shropshire under a false name. She lived there for 11 years before she actually died, in 1925, of pneumonia, alone, without her name. The kitchen clock ticked in the silence. Poirot said nothing for a moment. He was thinking about Dr. Crane's face, and the word disappeared, and the long pause before he'd answered. He had known or suspected, and had been living with it for 30 years. You confronted Sir Edmund, Poirot said. 2 months ago. Her voice was entirely calm. I showed him the letters. I told him I knew. I told him that unless he made it right, made some public acknowledgement, provided for Eleanor's memory, arranged a proper grave with her real name, I would take the letters to the police. She paused. He laughed. He said no one would believe a housekeeper over a baronet, and that the letters were circumstantial at best. But then he changed the will, Poirot said. He changed the will. Yes. Something flickered briefly in her face and was gone. "He told me, a month ago, that he was dying, that the doctor had given him months. He said—" She stopped, and for the first time something shifted in her voice, not breaking, but bending slightly under weight. "He said he was tired of being the kind of man he had been. He said he would leave me everything, that it was what he owed Eleanor." She paused. He seemed to believe this was enough. That money, after 30 years, was a sufficient accounting. "And was it?" Poirot asked. She looked at him. The expression on her face was complex in the way that only very long suffering makes a person's face complex. Layered, opaque, with things moving behind it that had no simple name. "I don't know," she said. I genuinely don't know." Poirot looked at her for a long moment, for he had one more question, and it was the only question that mattered now. "The other key to the study," he said quietly. "The duplicate. Where is it?" Mrs. Pont was very still. "Every housekeeper," Poirot said gently, "in a house of this age and size has a duplicate key to every room. This is not suspicion. It is simple, practical logic. You have been here 30 years. You know every door. You know every key." She looked at him, and she said nothing, which was, Poirot reflected, its own kind of answer. That evening, as the rain continued its patient assault on Ashford Manor and the household sat in the drawing-room in the particular strained quiet of people who have run out of small talk, Poirot requested something unusual. He asked Mrs. Pont to bring him every piece of paper that Sir Edmund had left in the study. All correspondence and all notes, the contents of the desk drawers, and specifically the blotter. Mrs. Pont brought them without comment in a cardboard box. She set the box on the library table and left without a word. Constable Hedges, who was still present because he had nowhere pressing to be and was rather enjoying the importance of it, watched Poirot go through the papers with polite bewilderment. "What are we looking for, sir?" he asked after a while. "I am looking," Poirot said without looking up, "for what is not here." He found it in 20 minutes. The desk had yielded the expected debris of a wealthy, slightly paranoid old man's private life. Old correspondence, 3 years of bank statements, notes in Sir Edmund's forward-leaning hand on topics ranging from projected estate income to the proper pruning of the yew hedges along the East Drive. And there was a locked diary. Poirot had the lock picked with a hairpin borrowed from the housemaid, who lent it without question and with evident satisfaction, that contained mostly accounts of physical symptoms and the occasional terse note. Crane came. What he says confirms it. Less time than hoped. And then, on a page 3 weeks before, letters found. She knows. Spoke to Voss, the only decent thing left. None of this was what he was looking for. What he was looking for was on the blotter. The blotter at the center of the desk had the indented record of many documents pressed upon it over many years, and most of this was invisible except to the light held at the right angle. Poirot held the lamp low and at a slant, and moved it slowly across the surface. Most of what emerged was the ghost of old letters, old signatures, and overlapping and indecipherable. But in the upper right corner, more recent, the impression was cleaner, less buried under subsequent use. There was the shadow of a sentence. Tonight. After everyone is asleep. It must be tonight. Poirot studied this for several minutes, very still. Then he asked Constable Hedges to take the blotter into evidence. He knocked on Dr. Crane's door at 9 that evening. Crane opened it immediately, as if he had been expecting this, which Poirot suspected he had. The doctor looked worse than he had that morning, thinner somehow, in a way that had nothing to do with physical dimension and everything to do with the weight of things he had been carrying for too long and could feel beginning to slip. "Sit down, doctor," Poirot said. He himself remained standing near the window. I want to tell you what I believe happened, and I want you to tell me where I am wrong." Crane sat. "All right," Sir Edmund, Poirot said, was a dying man. He knew this. He had also, in the final months of his life, discovered that 30 years of constructed security had a fault in it, Mrs. Pont. He chose not to fight her. He chose, perhaps for the first time in his life, to do the correct thing. The will, the letter inviting everyone to Ashford, the note. Poirot paused. The note on the desk was written by Sir Edmund himself. I've confessed my sin. Now it is the other's turn. He wrote it as a preamble to a conversation he intended to have this weekend with every person in this house. He looked at Crane. He was not going to die by accident or by another's hand. He had something very specific planned, Doctor, and he intended to take a sedative, something sufficient to render him insensible but not lethal. He intended to lock the study from the inside, leave the note, and allow himself to be found. In a kind of staged death, to observe, from whatever place the sedative took him to, what the people in this house did and said and revealed when they believed him dead. Crane had gone very pale. He told you, Poirot said. He asked me, Crane said very quietly. A week ago. He telephoned and he said he needed a sedative, something that would slow the heart, mimic death convincingly enough that no one would immediately challenge it. He said he had a plan. He said it was important. He looked at his hands. I told him it was insane. He said he was dying anyway, and so the word insane had lost some of its authority over him. And you provided it. Crane closed his eyes. I provided it. God help me. The dose, Poirot said. The dose you gave him, would it have been lethal? No. Crane's voice was barely audible. No? He should have been deeply insensible, to all appearances dead, for 4 to 6 hours, and then recovered. Shaken, perhaps unwell, but alive. He opened his eyes. That was what I gave him. But he died, Poirot said. The symptoms at examination, you recognize them as consistent with the compound you provided? Yes. A pause. But the amount, the degree of the effects, it was in excess of what I gave him. What I gave him should not have... He stopped. He had reached the conclusion Poirot had been walking him toward, and he sat with it, and his face changed. Someone, Poirot said quietly, knew or suspected that Sir Edmund had taken a sedative and added to it. Crane stared at him. How? He said. How would anyone have known? Sir Edmund, Poirot said, was not a man who kept his own counsel easily. He was theatrical. He enjoyed the architecture of a plan. He had spoken to you, to Voss, to Mrs. Pont, perhaps to others. He believed himself to be the author of the evening. Poirot paused. But someone was reading over his shoulder. He went back to the study after midnight, alone this time. Constable Hedges was asleep in the dining-room chair, a development Poirot had arranged by requesting he keep watch over the ground floor and providing him with an excellent supper beforehand. The house was quiet in the specific way of houses where everyone is awake and pretending not to be. And Poirot stood in the center of the study and turned slowly. The locked door, the key inside, the single crystal tumbler with its residue. He had asked the constable, earlier in the day, to have the tumbler sent to the county forensic laboratory. The results, when they came, would tell him what he already suspected. 2 compounds, Sir Edmund's sedative, taken voluntarily, and something else added afterward, something stronger, something final. The tumbler had not been washed. The killer, then, had not had the opportunity or the nerve to retrieve it, which meant the addition had been made to the drink before Sir Edmund consumed it, not after. Sir Edmund himself had poured his own death, simply unaware that what was in the glass was not only what he'd put there. The question now was, who had access to that glass? So, and how had they known what Sir Edmund was planning? The answer was in the kitchen. He was increasingly certain of this, not because Mrs. Pont had confessed to anything, but because of what she had said, and what she had not said, and the particular quality of her 30 years of waiting. She had wanted Sir Edmund to pay. She had also, Poirot thought, loved her sister with a love that had been the whole architecture of the last 3 decades of her life. And she had found, in the end, that money was not enough. But Poirot needed more than certainty. He needed truth, exact and provable, the way a bridge needs every rivet. He stood in the dead man's study and he thought, and slowly the little grey cells arranged the pieces into a shape he recognized. The following morning, Sunday, and the day on which Sir Edmund had intended to sign his will, Poirot gathered them all. He asked Mrs. Pont to open the library. It was the largest room on the ground floor apart from the dining room, and it had the advantage, practical as well as symbolic, of containing chairs for everyone and bookshelves that absorbed sound and created a particular quality of enclosed attention. He asked her to set chairs in a semicircle facing the fireplace. He asked her to be present herself and watched her face when he asked this and noted the careful way she said simply, "Yes, Monsieur Poirot." They came in at 10:30. The rain had finally stopped, and a thin, unconvinced winter light came through the library windows, catching the dust that old rooms always hold suspended in the air. Thomas Harcastle came first, hands in pockets, to performing ease. Lady Vivian followed with her coat still on, as if she had not yet decided to stay. Dr. Crane came with the careful step of a man picking his way through something broken. Nora Ashby sat down quickly in the chair nearest the door. Julian Voss set his document case, which he had brought automatically, perhaps from professional instinct, at his feet and folded his hands on his knees. Mrs. Clara Pont took the chair at the end of the row and folded her hands in her lap and looked at Poirot. Constable Hedges stood near the door. He had his notebook open and the expression of a man who is simultaneously aware that something important is about to happen and uncertain whether he will be able to follow it. Poirot stood with his back to the fireplace. He was quiet for a moment, not for effect, or not only for effect, but because he had the habit, learned over 4 decades, of allowing silence to do what questions could not. People filled silence differently than they filled conversation. In silence, the things they were managing became briefly visible. Thomas Harcastle's knee was moving, almost imperceptibly, up and down. Dr. Crane was studying the floor. Lady Vivian was looking at Poirot with the focused attention of someone who has decided that looking away would be, in some obscure way, an admission. Mrs. Pont was looking at nothing. "I'm going to tell you," Poirot said, "what happened on Friday night. I will ask, as I do so, that you resist the very human impulse to interrupt. There will be time for disagreement afterward, and I will welcome it if the disagreement is genuine. And I do not welcome disagreement manufactured for purposes of delay." He paused. No one spoke. Sir Edmund Harcastle, Poirot began, was a dying man. His doctor had told him he had months, perhaps less. He was a man who had, throughout his life, preferred the position of the observer, who had arranged situations in which others revealed themselves, while he himself remained concealed. In death, as in life, he wished to occupy this position. He looked around the semicircle. He arranged this weekend not to settle his affairs, but to conduct one final experiment upon the people he had spent his life using, damaging, or simply keeping close because they were useful. He wrote each of you a letter designed to provoke. He sent for a solicitor with 2 documents, one legitimate, one false. He acquired, with the assistance of Dr. Crane, a compound that would render him insensible and apparently dead. Dr. Crane looked up. His face was white. He intended, Poirot continued, to take this compound on Friday night, lock his study from within, leave a note, "I have confessed my sin. Now it is the other's turn," and allow himself to be found. He would observe, from his state of deep insensibility, what each of you did. Whether you grieved, whether you rejoiced, Whether you went immediately to the document case, or immediately to the telephone, or simply whether you sat down and wept. He paused. And on Sunday morning he would have recovered, signed his legitimate will, and explained to you all precisely what he had done and what he had observed, and who had passed what he considered his test. The arrogance of it, Thomas said flatly into the quiet. Quitte, Poirot agreed. It was a deeply arrogant plan, and it was also, in its strange way, a plan that held within it a kind of penitence, because the will he intended to sign would have constituted a public acknowledgment of the greatest wrong he had ever done. He looked at Mrs. Pont. She did not look away. Mrs. Clara Pont, Poirot said, the housekeeper, 30 years at Ashford, the sister of Lady Eleanor Harcastle, Sir Edmund's first wife, a woman who did not die, as was claimed in 1914, but was committed unlawfully to a private institution under a false name, where she lived for 11 years and died alone. He allowed this to settle. He heard Nora Ashby draw in a breath. Mrs. Pont came to this house to find the truth and to wait, and to ensure that some accounting was eventually made. I have not denied any of this, Mrs. Pont said. Her voice was entirely steady. No, Poirot agreed. You have not. He looked at her carefully. You knew, Mrs. Pont, what Sir Edmund planned for Friday night. Perhaps he told you directly. He told you about the will, and I suspect that in doing so he told you more than he intended about the performance he was planning. Perhaps you found evidence of his communication with Dr. Crane. Perhaps... He paused. It was simpler than either of those. Perhaps you simply knew him well enough, after 30 years, to read him. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, he was not as clever as he believed. He never was. No, Poirot said. He was not. He told you enough for you to understand that he intended to take something that night, and you... Poirot spoke gently and precisely, yet and without cruelty. You added to it. No one in the room moved. You had access to the study, Poirot said. You had a duplicate key. Every housekeeper does, and you have been this housekeeper for 30 years. You knew, from your 30 years, and from the contents of those letters, what he had done to Eleanor. And you knew that money, even an estate, even everything, was not going to be enough. Not after 11 years in an asylum under a false name. Not after a death certificate signed by a doctor who was too frightened to tell the truth. Not after 30 years of your life given to this house in service of a long, cold justice. He paused. You waited until the household was asleep. You used your duplicate key. You found Sir Edmund at his desk, already beginning to feel the effects of what he had taken. Drowsy, incapacitated, not yet fully insensible. You added the second compound to the remains of what was in his glass, or perhaps to a drink you brought him. Something offered with a housekeeper's quiet efficiency, so ordinary as to be invisible. He paused, and he drank it, and you left, and you locked the door behind you with your duplicate key and went back to your room. Mrs. Clara Pont sat in her chair and looked at him. The fire crackled once behind Poirot. And in the morning, Poirot said, you made tea. She didn't deny it. That was the first thing, and in some ways the only thing, that mattered. Because denial was what the room was holding its breath for, and when it didn't come, the quality of the silence shifted entirely. It became something else, not the silence before a verdict, but the silence after one. Exhausted, final, stripped of the particular tension that comes from not yet knowing. Mrs. Clara Pont sat in her chair, and she looked at Hercule Poirot, and she said nothing for what felt like a very long time. Then she said, he was awake when I came in. Poirot was still. He looked at me, she said. He was already slowed. Whatever Crane had given him was working. His hands were very heavy on the arms of the chair, but his eyes were open and he knew me. She paused. He knew who I was. The real who, not just the housekeeper. He had known for the past 2 months, ever since I showed him the letters. He looked at me and he wasn't afraid. I think he was relieved. The room held itself carefully around her words. I had brought his evening cocoa, she said. I'd been bringing it for 20 years. He drank it every night. It was his last habit. He never thought twice about it. She looked down at her hands. I had added something to it. Yes, something I had obtained. I will not tell you how or from whom. It doesn't matter now. She looked back up. He drank it. All of it. He set the cup down and he looked at me and he said, "Clara." She stopped. He used my name. My real name. He had not said it in 30 years. Nora Ashby made a small sound and pressed her hand to her mouth. He said, "Tell Eleanor I'm sorry." Mrs. Pont's voice was very quiet now and very clear, with the clarity of things stated for the last time. I told him that Eleanor was dead. He said he knew. He said, "Tell her anyway." She paused. And then he closed his eyes. And I took the cup, and I let myself out, and I locked the door. Constable Hedges, near the door. It was no longer writing in his notebook. He was simply looking at her in the way that people look at things they know will stay with them. "The note," Poirot said gently. "He had written it himself. You did not add that." "He wrote it himself," she said. "I saw it on the desk when I came in. He had written it and left the pen beside it. I have confessed my sin. Now it is the other's turn. He thought—" She stopped. He thought he was going to wake up. He thought that was the beginning of something. He thought his confession would— She paused for a long time. He thought a great many things at the end that were perhaps more hopeful than he had any right to be. "But you had decided," Poirot said, "that there would be no waking up." "I had decided," she said, "that Eleanor deserved more than a living man's remorse. So she deserved the end of the thing that had destroyed her." She said it without heat, without theatre. It was simply a statement of the logic she had lived by, distilled to its core. "I know what I have done. I'm not asking you to excuse it. I'm telling you the truth. Which is what we all came here for, isn't it? According to his letter." She looked around the room. At Thomas, whose whiskey-colored morning face had gone very still. At Julian Voss, who had both hands flat on his document case and was staring at the floor. At Dr. Crane, who had his eyes closed and looked as though he had aged 10 years in the last 20 minutes. At Lady Vivian, who was looking at Mrs. Pont with an expression that was not sympathy and not judgment, but something more complicated than either. At Nora, who was looking at her hands. "He wanted confessions," Mrs. Pont said. "He built a whole theatrical apparatus to extract them. He didn't need any of it." She looked at Poirot. "He simply needed to ask." Constable Hedges took her into custody with a decency that Poirot found himself genuinely grateful for. No drama, no rough handling, simply a hand under her arm and a quiet word. She went without resistance, without any of the last-minute protestations or desperate revisings of account that Poirot had seen in others. She had been carrying this for a very long time, and putting it down, whatever the consequences, appeared to have lifted something from her that had been bowing her for years. The others dispersed from the library in the slow, drifting way of people after something large. Not all at once, but by degrees, each finding a separate corner of Ashford Manor in which to absorb what had just happened. Nora Ashby found Poirot on the staircase 20 minutes later, and stood on the step below him so that they were almost at eye level. "The question of my parentage?" she said without preamble. "It's not answered." "No," Poirot agreed. "It is not." He paused. "But you know, mademoiselle, there is one thing Sir Edmund did in the end that may be worth noting. He raised you, badly perhaps. He was not equipped for tenderness, but he chose not to correct the record. Whatever his reasons, he allowed you the name and the history, when he might have withdrawn them." He looked at her. "Whether this constitutes love in any meaningful sense, I cannot tell you. but it was a choice. Not all choices made by limited people are entirely worthless. Nora Ashby looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "That's a very careful way of not telling me what to think." "I am always careful," Poirot said. "It is my greatest discipline and my most reliable vanity." She almost smiled and went up the stairs. Julian Voss found Poirot in the hall, coat and hat in hand, preparing for departure. "The will," Voss said. "The genuine one. Mrs. Pont as sole beneficiary. Under the circumstances." "That," Poirot said, "is a matter for the courts and for lawyers, which is to say it is a matter for you, Monsieur Voss, and I have every confidence in your ability to be adequately complicated about it for the appropriate length of time." He paused. "Yes, but I will say this. Eleanor Harcastle had a real name and a real grave somewhere in Shropshire. It seems to me that whatever else the estate is used for, finding that grave and marking it properly would be a beginning." Voss nodded slowly, and Poirot saw in the man's face the relief of someone who has been given, at last, a practical task. Practical tasks, in the aftermath of terrible things, are among the most valuable gifts one person can give another. Dr. Crane was in the garden when Poirot passed through for the final time, standing in almost exactly the spot where Lady Vivian had stood with her cigarette the morning before, looking out over the wet November lawn. Poirot paused beside him. "You will need to speak with the police," Poirot said, "about the compound, about what you provided, about what you knew." "Yes," Crane said, but he was very quiet. Not the quiet of shock anymore, but the quiet of a man who has made at last a decision that should have been made 20 years ago and has found, somewhat to his surprise, that the decision is not as impossible as he had believed. "I should have, in 1914, when Eleanor disappeared. I should have." "Yes," Poirot agreed simply. "You should have." He left a pause. "But the thing about the truth is that it will wait. It waited 30 years here. It waits with considerable patience." He looked at the old doctor, who had spent 4 decades being afraid, and thought of Eleanor Harcastle in a room in Shropshire with a false name, and found, within himself, something that was not quite forgiveness, for that was not his to give, but was perhaps compassion, which is a different thing entirely. "Go and speak the truth now, Doctor. It is, as Mrs. Pont has just demonstrated, not as impossible as it looks." Crane nodded. He did not thank Poirot. He simply nodded, and Poirot understood this to be, from a man of his generation, the deepest acknowledgement available. The motor car was waiting on the drive. Poirot stood for a moment on the front steps of Ashford Manor and looked up at it. The towers at the corners, the mullioned windows, the ivy that had been growing so long it had become structural. In the cold, clear aftermath of the rain, the house looked older than it had on Friday, more tired. A house, Poirot thought, takes on the character of what happens within it over time. Ashford had held 30 years of a housekeeper's patient, necessary grieving, and 30 years of a man's chosen ignorance about the wrong he had done and the wrong he was doing by living comfortably alongside it. These things left marks, not visible ones, not the kind that decorators could remedy, but the kind felt in the particular quality of silence in the rooms, in the way the light fell, in the cold that lived in certain corners regardless of the fire. He thought about Eleanor Harcastle, who had been beautiful first and herself second, according to her sister, who had loved, or been loyal to, the wrong man, who had died in a room somewhere with someone else's name. He thought about Clara Pont, who had given 30 years of her life to a justice she had achieved, and who would now pay whatever price the law determined a woman ought to pay for doing what the law had failed to do in her place. Only thought about Sir Edmund, who had, at the very end, wanted to be a better man, who had tried, in the only way available to someone who had spent 70 years treating the world as a stage for his own performance, to make something right. and who had found, as such men sometimes do, that the corrections they arrange for themselves are not always the corrections that arrive. He thought about the note. I have confessed my sin. Now it is the other's turn. It had been intended as the first line of an act of reckoning. Instead, it had been an epitaph. In the end, Poirot reflected, this was perhaps not entirely inappropriate. He descended the steps, got into the motor car, and gave the driver the address of his flat in Whitehaven Mansions. As the car moved down the long gravel drive, he permitted himself one backward glance at the house. The Ashford Manor stood against the cold winter sky, windows dark, ancient and patient, and entirely indifferent to the small human drama that had played out within it this weekend. It had held its secrets for 30 years, and Hercule Poirot had spent precisely 2 days coaxing them loose. He straightened his mustache, satisfied, not with the outcome, which was as tangled and sorrowful as human outcomes tend to be, but with the work itself, which had been precise, which had been true, and which had, in the end, given Eleanor Harcastle back her name. It was not justice, exactly. But it was, perhaps, the closest thing to it that 30 years of silence could accommodate.